I never thought a single train ride would change my entire life. I never thought that, stepping onto a cold, crowded platform on a bitter Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, mind already buried in spreadsheets and quarterly reports, would lead me to the two most important people I would ever meet. But that's the thing about life, isn't it? It doesn't warn you. It doesn't send a calendar invite or give you time to prepare. It just happens, raw and unplanned and completely overwhelming, and suddenly you're standing in the middle of a moment that redefines everything you thought you knew about yourself. I was a CEO. I had a corner office, a driver, a schedule packed from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. I had everything the world told me I was supposed to want. And yet, when a small voice tugged at the hem of my coat that morning and said, "Sir, my baby sister is freezing," I realized I had been missing everything that actually mattered. Was I wrong for what I did next? Some people in my life certainly thought so. They called it impulsive. They called it reckless. A few of my board members actually questioned my sanity. But I want you to watch this entire story, and then tell me, honestly, in the comments below, what you would have done if you had been standing in my shoes on that platform. Because I genuinely believe that any decent human being, any person with a heart still beating in their chest, would have done exactly the same thing. Let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand that morning, you need to understand who I was before it happened. My name is Daniel Hargrove. I'm 43 years old, and for the better part of the last 15 years, I have been the CEO of Hargrove Logistics, a mid-sized freight and supply chain company that my father built from nothing and handed to me when he retired. Growing up, I watched my father work 18-hour days. I watched him miss birthdays and school plays and Sunday dinners. And instead of learning the wrong lesson from that, instead of recognizing what he had sacrificed, I idolized it. I thought that was what success looked like. I thought grinding yourself into dust was something to be proud of. So that's exactly what I did. I married my college sweetheart, Angela, and within 4 years, the marriage was over. Not because we didn't love each other, but because I was never really there, even when I was sitting right across the table from her. We didn't have children. That was one of the greatest wounds I carried quietly, the fact that I had always imagined being a father, and had somehow let that dream slip through my fingers while I was busy answering emails at midnight. By the time I was 43, I lived alone in a beautiful 4-bedroom house that echoed when I walked through it. I had a housekeeper named Rosa, who came 3 times a week, and she was honestly the person I talked to most. That tells you everything you need to know about my life before that Tuesday morning. It was the first week of December, and the city had turned brutally cold almost overnight. One of those winters that arrives like it has a grudge. I normally had my driver, Marcus, take me to the office, but that morning Marcus had called in sick, and rather than call a car service, I had decided, somewhat impulsively, to take the commuter train. I thought maybe the change of scenery would do me good. I had a board presentation in 2 days, and I was already wound tight with stress. I grabbed my long charcoal wool coat, my briefcase, my coffee, and headed for the station about 3 blocks from my house. The platform was packed. December morning commuters, all of them bundled up and miserable, staring at their phones or staring at nothing. The kind of collective silence that cities do, where hundreds of people stand inches apart and pretend the others don't exist. I found a spot near the far end of the platform, away from the crowd, and I was scrolling through my emails when I heard it, a sound that cut right through the noise of the city and the wind and the distant rumble of an incoming train. It was a child coughing, a small, wet, ragged cough that sounded completely wrong for a place like this, completely out of place among the briefcases and travel mugs and winter coats. I looked up, and that's when I saw them. There was a boy sitting on the cold concrete floor of the platform, right up against the wall, huddled over something in his lap. He looked to be about 7 or 8 years old, though I would later learn he was actually 9, and just very small for his age. He was wearing a thin hooded sweatshirt that was at least 2 sizes too big, and jeans with a hole in one knee, and sneakers so worn that the sole on the left one was visibly separating from the upper. No hat, no gloves, no coat, His hair was dark and disheveled, and his face, when he looked up at me, was the face of a child who had learned very early that the world could be a cold and indifferent place. But what stopped my heart completely was what he was holding in his lap. Bundled up against his small chest was a baby. A little girl, maybe 18 months old, wrapped in what appeared to be a man's flannel shirt and very little else. Her lips were pale. Her tiny hands were curled against her chest. And she was shivering, visibly, terribly shivering. I stood there for a split second, maybe 2 seconds, and in that moment my entire brain, all of its executive function and strategic thinking, and carefully constructed professional distance, simply stopped working. And then the boy looked directly at me. Not pleading, not performing. Just looking, with these enormous dark eyes, like he had already been refused by enough people that he wasn't going to bother hoping. And then he said it. Quietly, almost apologetically. "Sir, my baby sister is freezing." I don't remember making a decision. I'm not sure there was one. My body just moved. I crouched down in front of him, set my coffee and briefcase on the ground, and I took off my coat. Just like that. That big, expensive, tailored charcoal wool coat that I had paid more for than most people's monthly rent. I wrapped it around both of them, the boy and the baby together, and tucked it in as best I could. The baby made a small sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, and instinctively pressed closer to her brother. The boy looked at me with an expression I cannot fully describe even now. It was gratitude and suspicion and exhaustion all mixed together. "Thank you," he whispered. I sat down on the platform floor next to him, in my suit, on the dirty concrete, and I asked him his name. He said it was Miguel. The baby's name was Lucia. And then, slowly, carefully, like he was testing each word before he said it, he told me the rest. Miguel and Lucia's mother, a woman named Carmen, had been hospitalized 3 days earlier. A serious infection that had started in her lungs and moved fast. Carmen was a single mother, had been since Lucia was born, and there was no father in the picture, hadn't been for years. There were no grandparents nearby, no aunts or uncles that Miguel knew how to reach. Carmen's only emergency contact listed at the hospital was a cousin named Delia who lived 40 minutes away, but Delia had not answered any of the hospital's calls. Miguel, being 9 years old and more resourceful than any 9-year-old should ever have to be, had taken Lucia from their apartment that morning. Because they had run out of food and the heat in their building had stopped working 2 days ago. He had bundled her up as best he could and walked to the train station because he knew there was a shelter 2 stops down the line that gave out breakfast in the mornings. He had done this before, he told me, with a matter-of-factness that broke something open in me. He had done this before. A 9-year-old boy navigating a city in winter with an infant on his hip, trying to keep them both alive while their mother lay in a hospital bed. I sat with that for a moment. I let it land. And then I asked him if he was hungry. He looked at me for a long moment and then nodded. Just once, like even admitting that was something he had learned to be careful about. I took them to the small cafe just inside the station entrance. I got Miguel a hot chocolate and a large breakfast sandwich and a banana, and I warmed a bottle of milk for Lucia, asking the woman behind the counter for a small bowl of warm water to heat it in, which she provided with the kind of quiet, immediate human kindness that you forget exists until you need it. I watched Miguel eat. He was hungry, in the way that children are hungry when it has been too long, eating fast, and then slowing himself down deliberately, like he was reminding himself to make it last. Lucia drank her warm milk, and the color came back to her cheeks, and she stopped shivering and looked up at me with these round brown eyes that were so alert, so alive, so completely trusting that I had to look away for a second to collect myself. My phone was buzzing in my pocket, my assistant, calling about the board prep meeting that was supposed to start in 40 minutes. I silenced it, and then I looked at Miguel and I said, "I want to help you, not just right now, I mean really help. Will you let me?" He looked at me for a long time, long enough that I wondered what he was searching for in my face. Then he said, "You're not going to take Lucia away, are you?" And I understood what he was asking. He was terrified of the system, terrified that help would mean separation. "I'm going to try very hard to make sure that doesn't happen," I told him. But I need you to trust me, even just a little bit. Can you do that? He thought about it. Then he nodded again, so that's where I was. Sitting in a train station cafe with a child and a baby I had met 40 minutes ago, my phone blowing up, my entire day's schedule imploding around me, wearing just my suit jacket in December. And I had a choice to make that felt enormous. I could call Child Protective Services right then, hand it over to the system, get to my meeting, and tell myself I had done the right thing. Or I could stay. I could actually stay and see this through. Before I tell you what I decided, I want you to stop for a second and ask yourself what you would have done. Drop it in the comments right now, seriously, because I've talked to a lot of people about this moment, and the answers surprise me every single time. Because it's easy to say you'd do the heroic thing when you're sitting comfortably watching a video. But when you're actually there, when there's a real board meeting and real professional consequences and a real system that technically exists for exactly this kind of situation, it is not as simple as it sounds. Tell me what you would have chosen, and then let me tell you what I did. I stayed. I called my assistant, Priya, and I told her to reschedule the prep meeting. She was quiet for a second and then said, "Is everything okay?" And I said, "It will be." I called my personal attorney, a woman named Stephanie Chen, who had handled everything from business acquisitions to my divorce, and I told her the situation. She told me to be careful, to document everything, and to contact the hospital and the social services office rather than taking any unilateral action. I did all of those things. I called the hospital where Carmen was being treated and confirmed that she was indeed a patient, that she was stable but serious, and that they had been unable to reach any of her emergency contacts. I called the social services office and spoke with a caseworker named Mr. Okafor, who was genuinely kind, and told me that without a verified family member, Miguel and Lucia would need to enter emergency foster placement while their mother recovered. When I explained that I was willing to serve as a temporary emergency caregiver and asked what that process looked like, there was a pause, and then he said, very carefully, that it was possible, but that it involved background checks and home assessments and court approval, and that in the meantime, the children would still need to go into the system. Miguel was sitting across from me. He couldn't hear the call, but he was watching my face. And I looked at him, this small, fierce boy who had been carrying his baby sister through a freezing December city on an empty stomach, and I made a decision that I knew was going to complicate my life significantly. I told Mr. Okafor that I would be bringing the children to my home, that I would be submitting to any and all required assessments immediately, and that I needed him to tell me every single step I had to take to do this properly and legally. Another pause. Then he said, "Sir, I need you to understand that this is a very serious commitment." And I said, "I know, that's why I'm making it." What followed was the most chaotic and bureaucratic and emotionally exhausting week of my life. And I say that as someone who has navigated mergers and hostile takeovers and a very contentious divorce. I had a social worker at my house within hours. My home was assessed. Rosa, my housekeeper, turned out to be an unexpected hero, appearing with shopping bags full of baby supplies and children's food, and a spare crib that belonged to her granddaughter, explaining in her calm and practical way that she had suspected for years that this house needed children in it. And she was glad someone had finally listened. My board meeting was postponed. My COO, a man named Frank who I had worked with for 12 years, called me and said, with genuine concern, "Daniel, are you having some kind of breakdown?" I told him I was having the opposite. Stephanie worked around the clock on the legal side of things. Mr. Okafor, who I would come to think of as one of the genuinely good people in an overwhelmed and underfunded system, guided me through every form and hearing and approval. I visited Carmen in the hospital on day 2. She was weak but conscious, and when a nurse told her that her children were safe and being cared for, she broke down completely. I sat with her for an hour. She was 31 years old, and she had been doing everything alone for so long that she had simply forgotten what it felt like to have someone in her corner. I told her that when she was well, I wanted to talk to her about real support, not charity but actual structural support, housing stability, childcare, a job if she wanted one, because I had a company and I had resources, and I had spent 15 years using those resources exclusively to make myself richer and not once to make anyone else's life better. She looked at me like I might be slightly unhinged. I told her that was a fair assessment. Miguel and Lucia stayed in my home for 11 days, while Carmen recovered, and the legal process worked itself through. Those 11 days rearranged my entire interior life. Miguel was serious and watchful and incredibly smart, the kind of child who reads the room before he enters it, who has learned to be useful as a form of protection. He helped Rosa in the kitchen without being asked. He sat at my dining room table and did his homework with a focus and a seriousness that put most adults I knew to shame. On the fourth night, he came downstairs at about 11 o'clock because he couldn't sleep, and he found me at the kitchen table with my laptop, working. Because that's what I did, I worked. He sat down across from me and said, "Do you have kids?" And I said no. He said, "How come?" And I said, "I guess I was always too busy." He thought about that for a moment and then said, with the devastating honesty of a 9-year-old, "That's kind of sad." I closed my laptop. "Yeah," I said, "it kind of is." We sat in the kitchen for another hour, and he told me about his favorite subject in school, which was science, and about his dream of becoming an astronaut. And I told him about my father, and about the company, and about the life I had built that was very successful and very empty. It was the most honest conversation I had had with another human being in years, and my conversational partner was 9 years old and had holes in his sneakers. When he finally went back upstairs to bed, he stopped at the kitchen doorway and said, "You're not that bad for a rich guy." I laughed, alone in my kitchen, for a long time. Carmen came home at the end of that second week. Not to her old apartment, which had still not had its heating restored, but to a short-term furnished apartment that I arranged through a housing nonprofit I had quietly begun funding. Stephanie helped me set up a proper support structure, all documented, all above board, nothing that could be construed as anything other than one human being helping another. I worked with Carmen's case through proper channels to ensure she had access to a job training program, to stable childcare for Lucia, and to medical follow-up care that her insurance hadn't been fully covering. She was proud, and she was initially resistant, because pride is the armor that people who have been surviving on their own for too long wear to protect themselves. But gradually, over weeks and then months, she allowed it. Miguel started at a better school closer to the new apartment. He joined a science club. He sent me a photograph of himself in a lab coat, holding a beaker, grinning the way 9-year-olds are supposed to grin, and I put it on my desk at the office, right next to my quarterly earnings report, which felt exactly right. Lucia learned to walk. Carmen, who turned out to have an extraordinary head for logistics and supply chain operations, took a position with my company's community hiring program and proved herself so thoroughly in the first 6 months that she earned a full-time coordinator role. She told me once, over coffee, that she had spent her whole life feeling like she was one emergency away from losing everything, and that she was starting, for the first time, to believe that might not be true anymore. I won't tell you that I became a different person overnight, because that's not how it works, and I refuse to be dishonest with you. I still work too much. I still have trouble disconnecting. I still sometimes sit in that big house and feel the echo of it. But I also spend Sunday mornings with Miguel and Lucia and Carmen when our schedules allow. I have funded 3 additional emergency childcare initiatives through the company's newly established community foundation. Frank, my COO, who initially thought I was having a breakdown, is now the foundation's biggest internal champion, because it turns out that when you give people the chance to do something genuinely good, most of them leap at it. And Miguel, this past spring, presented a science project at his school about aerospace engineering. He got first place. I was in the front row. I cried, which I am not embarrassed to admit, because if a 9-year-old boy holding a trophy for a rocket project he built himself doesn't make you cry, you might want to check that you're still alive. I think about that train platform a lot. I think about all the people who were standing on it that morning, all of us in our coats and our routines, all of us looking at our phones. And I wonder how many of them walked past Miguel before I got there. I wonder if they heard that small cough and kept walking. I am not judging them. I might have been one of them, on any other day, in any other frame of mind. But I wasn't, that day. That day I looked up, and a 9-year-old boy's voice cut through everything I had built around myself, and reminded me that I was a person before I was a CEO, and that being a person comes with responsibilities that don't appear on any balance sheet. If I learned anything from that cold December morning, it's this: the moments that change your life almost never arrive, announced. They tug at the hem of your coat when you're not expecting it, and the only question that matters is whether you stop. If this story moved you, the way that morning moved me, I want you to hit that like button right now. And if you believe that more people need to hear it, please share this video, because sometimes a story is the thing that reminds someone to look up from their phone. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this. Real, human, complicated, heartwarming stories about the moments that crack us open and make us better. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you think I did the right thing. Tell me if you would have done the same. Tell me what you would have done differently. I read every single comment, and I mean that. Because this community that we're building here, this space for honest and human conversation, that matters to me more than I know how to say. Take care of yourselves. Look up from your phones once in a while, and I'll see you all in the next story.